好，那各位观众好，那还有我们国际的来宾大家好。那今天是我们绿色公民行动联盟举办福岛核灾10年省思全球核能的国际论坛。那因为全球疫情的缘故那所以其实呢，我们只能邀请由线上来举办这样的一个国际论坛。那我们本来也是可以全程做线上的，但因为幸好我们台湾的疫情控制得当所以我们其实很想要在台湾做一个现场的这样子的一个空间，能够让大家能够现场的在这边来听我们4位讲者，因为我们也准备这个同步口译。那等一下呢，也可以让大家现场提问，那可以跟讲者做这个进一步的一个交流。那等一下我们的提问方式呢，想各位是不是手上都有拿到我们这一份这个介绍？就是我们这次的提问方式呢，是采线上的提问，所以请各位呢扫描这上面的 QR code， 在线上呢，你可以用手机或用电脑打字，把您的提问打上去。那等一下在 Q&A 时间，我们会把您的问题提出来，然后再请我们的讲者来回答。那我们今天呢举办这样的一个国际论坛呢，很重要的原因是因为今年是福岛核灾的10周年。那福岛核灾10周年呢，我们很希望从这样的契机，希望大家能够重新再关注核电的议题。那我想大家非常想要了解，就是在福岛核灾10周年之后呢，目前全球核能现状发展的产业发展现况到底如何？那其实呢，绿盟一直都有跟这个世界核能产业报告呢做一个中文摘要版的一个合作。那我们已经连续好几年都把他们的这个报告的中文版摘要以及英文的原文呢都放上网站让大家下载。那今年就是因为福岛核灾10周年，我们想要特别的举办一个这样的一个论坛，可以请这报告的这些讲者群，可以能跟大家做更多的一些交流。那当然还有一个很重要的原因是，今年8月，我想各位知道，就是台湾有所谓的公投的时间，而这公投里面呢，有一个是跟核能相关的议题，也就是核四的运转公投。在今年8月28号，需要为核四是否要重新启动商转这件事情呢做出选择。但是我们觉得在公投前呢，相关的讨论仍然缺乏尤其是核电在全球发展现况的这些基本数据。台湾很多的社会上面还有很多人不太了解，充满了许多跟事实不同的迷思跟误解。因此，我们今天邀请了这4位的讲者。那这4位讲者是来自4个国家的能源学者跟顾问。那包括在全球能源界有高度声誉的国际能源和核能产业分析师跟政策顾问，也就是世界核电产业现况报告的召集人 Mycle Schneider， 以及另外3位来自不同国家的作者。等一下我们一一跟各位介绍。那我们共同以跨国线上发表的形式来介绍2020年最新的年度报告所分析的关键趋势，包括全球核电产业在福岛核灾后持续衰退，在全球疫情下受到冲击，以及再生能源在相较之下的突破性进展。希望能让各位关心台湾如何迈向能源转型关键下一步的各位产业界、大众以及政策制定者能够提供扎实的研究结果，促进良性的公共政策讨论。那今天的活动是由绿色公民举办，那也希望大家能够持续支持我们这样的一个环保团体。在外面有我们的团体的介绍，各位的桌上也会有这次核四公投的我们所制作的一些问答与文宣。那也希望大家能够帮我们多多传播，甚至多多支持我们这样的团体。谢谢。那我们就先来介绍我们今天的讲者。那我们今天讲者已经在这边等了，从6点半我们就开始连线等到现在那我们先来介绍，我们有4位讲者，那也请我们的讲者可以跟大家挥挥手。那我们第一位是我们的 Mycle Schneider， 我们的法国巴黎独立顾问，世界核能产业现况的报告计划的协调人跟主要作者，请 Mycle 跟大家打个招呼，谢谢。那我们第2位是来自英国伦敦的 Antony Froggatt， 那他也是世界核能产业报告主要作者之一。那等一下他们都会做更多的自我介绍。那再来就是我们第3位是来自美国哈佛大学甘乃迪政府学院管理原子和国际安全计划的研究员。非常感谢他。那再来一位是来自德国柏林理工大学经济与基础建设政策工作组副研究员，也是这个报告的协力作者Ben Wealer。好，那我们接下来的时间就由我们的这个Mycle Schneider 先生呢，来直接向我们这4位一起来做这份报告。好，那我们把时间交给这4位。
very much for inviting us. And with all problems we have in this global pandemic, I think it's fantastic to be able to put together 4 of the 6 main authors of this report, one based in Beirut in Lebanon and one based in Berlin, but he's actually originally from Luxembourg, to be precise. One based in London, Antony, and one myself based in Paris, but obviously originally I'm from Germany. So it's as you already see, it's a very international team. And I will share my screen so that you will be able to see the PowerPoint presentation that we have put together. And I will run it here from Paris. And are you getting the right screen now? That's the only thing I cannot see. Antony, is this the right screen?
Yep, it's fine.
Okay. So we have international team, not only from various countries, but also from various disciplines. And the 2020 report had also a foreword by 2 distinguished experts, Frank von Hippel from the Princeton University and the former chair of nuclear safety and security from South Korea, Jung-Min Kang. You might want to have a look at. The report is available online. It's a 360-page report, and the main idea is really to do multi-indicator analysis over the long time. And these various indicators together provide you with a fairly comprehensive picture of where the nuclear industry comes from and where it's likely to head in the future. So let me start right up here with the reactor startups and closures in the world from the beginning in 1954 to the end of 2020. And we see these 2 major waves in the 1970s and the 1980s, and then a rather low level development over the past 30 years. In 2020, we had 5 startups, but we had 6 shutdowns, closures of reactors. So there were more reactors closing than starting up. The year before then, 2019, it was the opposite. If we look into more detail, though, we realize that the picture is very much dominated by China. Over the past 10 years, and actually even before, China played the very major role in adding nuclear power reactors to the world's electricity grids. In 2020, we had 5 startups, of which 2 were in China, and 1 each in the United Arab Emirates, in Belarus, and in Russia. We had 6 closures, as I said before, 2 each in France and the US, 1 in Sweden and 1 in Russia. Now, if you take China out of the picture, out of the same picture, this is what it looks like. So you see that over the past 30 years, there was very little movement in terms of reactor startups and rather dominating picture of the closures. This is the accumulated picture. So we have seen this uninterrupted rise until the end of the 1980s, and then this flat development until the events of 3/11, 11th of March 2011, with the Fukushima events beginning, because the disaster is not finished. That's why we speak about the beginning of the catastrophe. And we saw over the last few years sort of a rebuild up of nuclear reactors and the installed operating capacity. While the number of reactors remains far below what we have seen before, like the maximum historically was 438. By the end of 2020, we had 412 operating units. But the operating capacity was quasi-identical in 2020 with the maximum we had seen in 2006. If we look at the electricity generation by nuclear power plants, we see this development until the maximum in 2006. No surprise here, that was also the level of the highest installed capacity. And so we saw an electricity generation in 2019. The 2020 figures are not available yet. That was almost at the level of the maximum. But at the same time, we see that the relative share of nuclear power in the global commercial electricity generation went down from 17.5% in the middle of the 1990s to roughly 10% in 2019, and that will most likely have lowered in 2020. Again, if we look at the role that China played in this development, in the increase level of 3.7% in 2019, half of it was due to China's increase in nuclear power generation. If we take China out of the equation, we see that very little has happened since this dramatic drop in 2000, following the 2011 events in Japan. It's a very flat development. We look into the future, then obviously one indicator that is crucial is reactors that are listed as under construction. In the world, we see we had this huge mountain by the end of the 1970s. The historic peak was in 1979 with 234 reactors, and currently we have at the end of 2020 51 reactors, and it's been around 50 reactors for the past 3 years. Now, it is important to realize that a reactor that is listed as under construction not necessarily will be completed. And Taiwan is an example, as a couple of reactors have been listed as under construction for a long time, but have never been completed as yet. So many abandoned plants. One can say it's about 1 in 8 of the reactors that are not being completed and connected to the grid. If we look at these reactors currently under construction, or as of end of 2020, no surprise here, it's 17, by far the largest number in China, then India, South Korea, and United Arab Emirates with 3. The other countries are having basically 1 or 2 reactors under construction on one construction site. If we're looking at the time frames, it's amazing because we see that some of the units, in particular in Iran, 1 unit currently under construction started building already in the middle of the 1970s. and some of these reactors started building in last year. So we see that if we analyze the time frames, that around 30 reactors are behind schedule, of around 50 reactors under construction, and many of the ones that are not listed as as behind schedule have actually started building very recently. So it's difficult to tell whether they are behind schedule or not. We have assessed, and we do this every year, the units that started up over the past decade, 63. The mean construction time is 10 years, where one has to be very precise because construction beginning, so the duration means the concreting of the foundations of the reactor building. So this is not including the time it takes to prepare the site and to actually start the actual building of the reactor, the main reactor components. We see there's a huge range of between just over 4 years to over 40 years. And we see that the countries fare very differently when it comes to performance in terms of duration between construction start and grid connection. We have done a more precise assessment of the 15 units that started up in the 2-year period, 2018-2019, of which 9 in China, 5 in Russia, and 1 in South Korea. And roughly you can say that the estimated construction time was below 5 years or around 5 years. And if we look at reality, the outcome is roughly double of what was expected, with a notable exception of 1 reactor in China that was built according to plan, and 2 with minor extensions of the construction duration. An interesting point here is maybe the 2 Russian reactors, Academic Lomonosov 1 and 2, estimated construction time 3.7 years, real time 12.7, so almost 4 times longer. And these are small reactors, 30 megawatt reactors. They were called the floating reactors because they're built on barges. And those were meant to demonstrate the feasibility and commercial viability of so-called SMRs, the small modular reactors. And it turned out that it didn't really work as planned, with much longer construction times and therefore much higher costs. The next indicator is the construction starts of nuclear reactors in the world. We see again a very early peak, historic peak of the number of construction starts, with 44 in the world in 1976. We see that this number went down to 0 in 1995. And what we've seen over the past 2 decades is an intermediate sort of peak of 15 and then going down to 5 in 2020. The green bars here show reactors that are still under construction. And so we have some of these projects have been under construction for very long time periods. If we do again a more detailed analysis on who is actually starting the construction of nuclear reactors, we realize that in the past few years, like in 2020, it's 4 and 5 in China and 4 and 6 in China in 2019. Take China out, and we see this very low level of building in the world. 1 or 2 reactors, 4 here in 2018, 3 in 2017. So very, very low level of building around the world. If you're not building, it means that the reactor fleet in the world is the age increases constantly, and it's reached now an average age of over 30 years, with a very large number now, a very large share that has been operating for 31 and more years. We have looked at the top 5 nuclear electricity generators and how the average age of their fleets has actually evolved. And you see that the United States basically has increased the age of reactors since the middle of the 1970s. And you see the same kind of picture with a 10-year delay in France. And so straight lines up, increase in the average age of the fleets. We have the world average here with over 30 years. The only country that actually came down from a very high level was Russia, because they closed the oldest units and started up a few new ones. South Korea is sort of in the middle, and China is the only country that has an average age of below 10 years. Now, interesting is, what does that mean in terms of expectancy of lifetimes? And we have looked at the reactors that have been shut down in the 5-year period, 2015 to 2019, with a 42.4-year average age. We have done the same calculation for the period 2016 to 2020. 21 reactors closed at an average age of 43.4 years. So it's a little higher, but it's significant to have that in mind because it will define the expectancy for upcoming reactor closures. And with that, I'll hand it over to Ali Ahmad, who will speak about the developments in the Middle East. We have had a special chapter on the Middle East because of the historic event of the first reactor starting up in the Arab world in the United Arab Emirates. And I'll pass it over to you.
Thank you very much, Mycle. Hi, everyone. First of all, I would like to thank the Green Citizen Action Alliance for hosting us today and giving us this platform to share our work. As Mycle has mentioned, my role in the report and in today's presentation is to speak to you about the Middle East. The nuclear activities in the region may seem recent, but actually the region has a long history of interest in nuclear energy that dates back to the 1950s and 1960s, especially with the Iranian nuclear program and the Egyptian nuclear program. Now, the interest in nuclear energy in the region comes or stems from 2 sets of reasons. First, the officially announced reasons that governments put forward to justify their interest in nuclear energy, and this includes reducing the reliance on oil, promoting diversification of energy sources, and achieving energy security. But also, as you can imagine, geopolitics and geoeconomics play an important role in developing these programs, and this is the second set of reasons, which are often unspoken or are implicit. And these include, of course, the politicization of this nuclear program, and Iran's nuclear program is a case in point. Also, the Emirati nuclear program, part of it was related to a prestige factor, etc. So what you see on this map is a map of progress of these nuclear power projects in the region. So the countries, we have so far 6 countries in the region that are interested in nuclear energy. The two most advanced countries, as Mycle mentioned, are Iran and the UAE, because they do have an operating nuclear reactor and also have some reactors in construction in the pipeline. The second country the second category is countries that have reactors under construction, and Turkey is the example here, which currently has 2 reactors under construction in collaboration with Russia. The rest of the countries, and I mean Jordan, Egypt, and Saudi Arabia, they do have interest in nuclear energy. Egypt is perhaps the most advanced in the sense that they are currently conducting site preparation work. But Jordan and Saudi Arabia although they have plans to build nuclear energy, so far they have not taken any steps to advance their program. Next slide, please. As Mycle also mentioned about the delay in the Iranian nuclear reactors, actually all the active nuclear programs in the region, and by active I mean reactors that are either operating or under construction, they have witnessed substantial delays. Clearly the most, or the longest of which is the Bushehr reactor, which was delayed by more than 35 years, mostly because of political reasons. But what is interesting about this slide is the case of the United Arab Emirates, because the Emirati nuclear program, since its inception, was labeled as a textbook model for the nuclear industry, and essentially was promoted as the best environment to develop nuclear energy in a country that has deep pockets and has access to the best companies and consultancies, etc. And yet we see that the Emirati nuclear program was delayed, at least the first reactor was delayed by more than 3 years. And as we will see in later slides, this delay has had a big impact on the economics of energy in the country. Even the Turkish nuclear program was also delayed by around the same time, which is 3 years, mostly relating to delaying the start of the project. Next slide, please. So when a nuclear reactor gets delayed, clearly it has huge and substantial, huge financial and economic costs. Nuclear power projects are capital intensive. So the more delays you have to pay more interest during construction, and you have to defer a lot of revenues in the future. And this really affects the economics of nuclear projects. However, another important victim of these delays is the opportunity cost of nuclear energy versus other sources of energy. And the energy sector is one of the most dynamic sector, and almost every year there's some substantial new technological advancements and cost advancements in different energy sectors. And here, what you see on this slide is a manifestation of this opportunity cost. So what you see here is a set of costs of energy in the United Arab Emirates. The shaded part is the cost of the nuclear reactor, which started in 2012 at 72 cents per kilowatt. And this is before the delays and before assuming any extra costs on top of that. So the likely cost, the latest cost is likely to be much higher than that. Now, the other set of costs, which you see in the colors, are the costs of solar technologies, solar CSP, solar thermal, and solar PV. And as you can see, after 2012, it did not take too long for the UAE itself to be a hub of very cost-competitive solar projects in the region. And actually, in the last few years, the UAE has been home to record-breaking low prices in the world. And now the latest prices went to 13 or 10 cents per kilowatt, which is really a ridiculously low number, almost less than 1/5 of the cost of nuclear energy. Next slide, please. Clearly, I mean, the UAE, be it on nuclear and other energy sources, they do have some advantages when it comes to cost, given the government commitment to support these projects. So one might ask or wonder if the same trend of cost competitiveness also applies to other countries in the Middle East. And the answer is yes, of course, when it comes to renewable energy. So what you see here is renewable energy across the 6 Middle East countries that are considering nuclear projects. Solar PV has been proven to be way more cost competitive than nuclear. What's interesting here is that all of those countries, except for Turkey perhaps, which relies more on renewable energy in the form of hydropower, all of the Middle Eastern countries have substantial reliance on natural gas. And natural gas can be coupled very effectively with renewables to actually form a mix of electricity sources that is not only reliable, but also very, very cost competitive compared to nuclear energy. Thank you, and this is over from my side. And Mycle, if I missed anything, please feel free to add.
Thank you very much, Ali. Just in a quick going back here, we were talking in US dollars per megawatt hour for all of the numbers that are as well as in this slide. Thank you, Ali. I will give a brief overview of the special chapter we have made in the 2020 report on a sort of a first glimpse at the impact of the global pandemic on the nuclear industry. And this is very, how can I say, very partial, and this is just the first piece of work, and it needs much more in-depth analysis, which goes far beyond what we can do in this annual report. But what we saw is that very clearly some key safety and security issues were in jeopardy, in particular because of a whole range of activities like periodic and frequent testing, four eyes principle for example, in the control rooms, couldn't be necessarily fulfilled. Those are critical situations that come up when you're running into problems of staffing. Now, the first thing we realized is that there's no public systematic national reporting. There is no basis, therefore, for an international comparison, statistical comparison. So what I'm going to give you is just a few examples, and it's by no means comprehensive, and I'm only going to pick out a few examples from these slides. You can read faster than I can speak anyway. So the largest nuclear utility in the world, the French Électricité de France, or EDF, has reported around 600 cases over a 12-week period as of mid-June 2020. The regulator in France has reported no cases whatsoever, but it's unknown what their procedures of testing and analysis was. The technical support organization in France, the Institute for Radiation Protection and Nuclear Safety, IRSN, has reported 9 people infected, but they had only 13 tested of 1,800 staff. So this is like a very surprising and not very telling statistics, but that's what we got. In the UK, the example of Hinkley Point B, which is also run by a subsidiary of EDF, there was one dead person reported, but no other numbers were released on the site. It's very clear that there were dramatically reduced staff levels in many nuclear facilities. For example, EDF cut down staffing by 2/3 that were put on telework. Now, it's obvious that these 15,000 people had a job to do on site. that is not, evaporating by this mere fact of an global epidemic. But what this means is that as a consequence, you have problems of oversight, of instruction, to particular in cases of contractors and subcontractors. This has led, at least in one documented case, to an accident, a hydrogen explosion with physical harm to at least 2 workers. In the US, there were, as in other countries, there were suspension of safety and security training sessions. So that has an impact, it's obvious. But maybe the case that was most common was the reorganization of the refueling and maintenance outage schedules. And that meant that, as it was termed, to eliminate non-critical work. Now, that is a very difficult criteria to define, and it's obviously a question: what do you call critical or non-critical? It's also important to see that virtually all of the physical site inspections by safety authorities were halted in many countries, at least in Canada, Finland, France, and the US. It is documented. We don't have all the information on all the countries. So we have clearly a situation of a degradation of the safety and security conditions under which reactors were operated. And by the way, not only nuclear reactors, but also other nuclear facilities. Getting off the very short term, it's very clear that there will be large financial and economic impacts that hit many of the nuclear utilities. And again, France here as an example, EDF has announced an increase of its net debt to 42.3 billion by the end of 2020. And it has announced that the nuclear production has dropped by almost 12% over the year compared to 2019, which was already a bad year. What is interesting here, and this is an EDF slide, which I copy-pasted into the presentation from their annual results 2020. And it says here that nuclear output was down 44 terawatt hours, of which 33 terawatt hours due to the COVID crisis. Now that means that another 11 terawatt hours so a quarter was due to other issues, other problems the operator is facing. And here's one of them. Like, this is the representation of the reactor by reactor outages amongst French reactors in 2019. There were still 58 reactors operating. Now 2 have been closed in 2020, so it's only 56. But these 58 reactors cumulated 5,580 reactor days, which is an average of over 3 months of the time of the year that these reactors have not generated any power. This is not including lowering of output. It's only illustrating, showing zero production by the reactors. And you can see this goes from a few days to virtually the entire year for one of the reactors. Now, the other thing which was striking for us, that these are declared, most of this time is declared as planned unavailabilities versus the darker parts declared as forced unavailabilities. And we have looked into that in more detail. And we realized that the way the operator declares outages is that once an outage was planned, it always remained a planned outage. So even if an outage was extended by many days, sometimes it can be an entire year, then it still remains a planned outage. And so we have tried to separate both, and we realized that the outages were 44% longer than planned at the beginning of the outage. 44%. That is 1,700 days of those 5,580 days. So it basically means the operator doesn't really know anymore when it starts an outage, for how long it will last, and when the reactor will be operating again. And this is not only one reactor that then will not be available, but you can see that for over 80% of the year, 10 reactors or more did not generate any power. And even for a period of almost 2 months, 53 days, it was 20 reactors or even more, at least 20 reactors for almost 2 months that were not available at the same time. Now, this was a little window of analysis on France. We do this every year. We have focus countries, and this is a little window on the situation in the United States. What we see here is those are reactors that were scheduled for so-called early retirements between 2009 and 2025. Now, of those, this is as of middle of 2020. One additional reactor, Duane Arnold, was closed down, and in the second half of 2020, and Indian Point 3 was just closed down about a week ago at the end of April. So what we see here, the most interesting part we see here, when we see the green part is construction, the blue part is operation, and we see that this part here is the licensed operational period, and we see that these reactors have been closed long before the end of their license period because they basically cannot compete in the electricity market anymore. Here is a blip on Germany. You know that Germany has an official nuclear phase-out plan. The last remaining reactors are supposed to be shut down, closed by the end of 2022. And this is the evolution of the power system between the year prior to the year of Fukushima, the Fukushima events starting, and 2020. And there is a lot of myth around the German phase-out decision, saying, well, they're phasing out nuclear, but they're burning more fossil fuels. And it's striking to see that if you combine the decrease in electricity consumption and the increase, this is the differential, this is not total quantities, it's the differential between 2010 and 2020. You combine both and you actually see that the nuclear has been reduced significantly, but the increase in renewables was twice as much as the reduction in nuclear, and it allowed, together with consumption decrease, to dramatically reduce fossil fuel consumption. And this is mainly lignite, so the dirtiest fossil fuel, and hard coal, while natural gas has been relatively stable compared to earlier years. And with this, I give it over to Ben Wealer, who's been focusing on decommissioning and heads the analysis on the decommissioning status report.
Thank you very much, Mycle. And let me join the other authors in thanking the Green Citizens Alliance for having us. I hope you can all hear me well, and my internet connection is working well because I had already some issues today. So if I just let me know if there are some problems. Thank you, Mycle, for the introduction. First, here you can see an overview of the completed reactor decommissioning projects until 2020, middle of last year. Since 2018, we are monitoring the decommissioning status worldwide. At that time, we identified 19 completed decommissioning projects worldwide. And in 2020, we added La Crosse in the US to this list. You can see that's only 3 countries where decommissioning was completed. The latest La Crosse in the US was technically completed after 37 years after the closure of the reactor. The reactor has not yet been released from regulatory control. In this diagram, you see in green the construction duration, in blue the operating duration, and in brown the decommissioning duration. And in some cases, you can see that decommissioning, so the brown stage, takes longer than actually construction and operating combined. If you look at the decommissioning duration, we found an average of 20 years. With a high variance, of course. We have very fast decommissioning projects, for instance, the Elk River plant in the US, where decommissioning was completed 6 years after closure, but we also have in the US, for instance,
Ben's sound is gone.
For the closure of the reactor. It's gone?
You're back.
Okay, sorry. So what the last reactor was the longest reactor that we have in this list is the CVTR reactor, also in the US, where decommissioning was completed 42 years after closure. Thank you, Mycle. So we go over to the next slide. So in this diagram or in this figure, you see all the nuclear power plants under active decommissioning. We are looking at 11 selected case studies. In order to monitor the decommissioning process worldwide, we divided the actual decommissioning process in 3 distinct stages. We have the warm-up stage, which you can see here in blue. This is the stage after the closure of the reactor. We have the first logistics are installed, where you have decontamination works, and then we have the hot zone stage. This is both from a technological but also from radiological point of view, the most demanding, the most difficult stage. Here you go into the reactor core, you decommission the pressure vessel, the internals, and after this, we enter the ESOP stage in brown. You see this. This is the stage where you have the last decontamination works, and in most cases, the dismantling of the building. After this, we count the decommissioning work as completed. As you can see, it's mostly in the beginning, everything is mostly orange. Only in France and in Germany, we have reactors undergoing the hot zone stage. And this figure also indicates the little progress that has been made in the last years. But the largest number, again, of course, in the US, with the largest number of decommissioned reactors. Not included in these pictures are the reactors in long-term enclosure, or in some cases safe storage. Here decommissioning is postponed to the next decades, for instance, 60 years in the US, or in some cases even longer. Thank you, Mycle. Next slide. So here you see an overview of 11 selected countries. Since 2018, we increased the case studies. We now cover 164 reactors, where we look closely at the decommissioning process. This represents 87% of all closed reactors worldwide. And in this table, on the third row from the right, you see the numbers of reactors in long-term enclosure. 66 are now reactors. We have 66 reactors where decommissioning is postponed into the next decades. The majority, half of those reactors is in the UK with 30 closed reactors, but also other countries. The US has 12 reactors in long-term enclosure, but also France, Russia, and Canada have increased numbers of reactors in enclosure. These four major nuclear countries, so France, Russia, Canada, and UK, have not decommissioned one single reactor so far. If you look at the different stages, you can see that the majority is in the warm-up stage, 55 reactors. Only a few are in the hot zone, and 13 are in the ESOP stage. 20 reactors, as I already mentioned, have been decommissioned, but if you look more closely at these 20 reactors, only 10 of those have been decommissioned onto the greenfield side, so that there's actually a green field, no buildings are left, only 10 are still awaiting this stage. If you look closer at these reactors, 20 reactors, this represents only around 6 gigawatt of capacity. This means that those are prototype or demonstration reactors, and this represents only 7% of the total installed capacity withdrawn from the grid. So these figures show that decommissioning is only at its beginning. The most advanced reactor country is the US, where 37% of the total those reactors have been decommissioned. Thank you, Mycle. Next slide, please. So therefore, we had a closer look at the US. We did a focus country chapter here. Here in the US, we see that we have an emerging decommissioning market. Contrary to other countries, for instance, in Germany, it was already the case in the US that there were general decommissioning contractors. So a company would come and decommission the reactor for the operator. This was done, for instance, by the waste management company Energy Solutions for 4 units. But a new trend is emerging that we have major waste management companies, Energy Solutions, but also Orano or Holtec, which are buying licenses from the reactors. So they in fact buy the reactor, they get the license, they have the decommissioning license to take over the decommissioning funds and decommission the reactors. There could be some advantages. This could speed up the decommissioning process. There could be efficiency gains, as these are waste management companies, so they have access to waste management facilities, and when they decommission the reactors. But also these processes need much more scrutiny and analysis, because what happens if such a company takes over the funds and exhaust the funds, and what does that? It's not clear what happens then. Is the taxpayer going to step in, or what's the legal procedure here? So this needs further scrutiny and more analysis. That was it for decommissioning. Thank you, Mycle. Back to you.
Thanks very much, Ben. On decommissioning, now I pass it over to Antony, who will cover essentially our traditional chapter where we compare trends in the nuclear sector and compare it with trends in the renewable energy sector. It's your turn.
Thank you very much, and thank you for the opportunity to speak this evening. As Mycle said, this is a traditional chapter. It has endeavored to assess how renewables, and in here we're primarily looking at new renewables, by which we mean non-hydro renewables, largely solar and wind, are developing alongside nuclear. And of course, this is crucial because we know that we face an imminent climate crisis. We need to decarbonize the energy sector, and particularly the power sector, as rapidly as possible. And countries are putting in place policies to help that occur. And policies need to be not only timely, but also they need to be economically efficient. And in some ways, this is what we're seeing with this graph, is that when policies are put in place that create a successful legal framework, then you see large volumes of investment going into renewables. And it's orders of magnitude difference on the global level between what we've seen invested in renewables compared to nuclear. And here, so basically we're seeing in 2019, just around 300 million dollars of investment into renewables. The figures for 2020 are very slightly higher, and that comes from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. So despite the global recession, despite COVID, you've seen an increase in renewable investment globally. And I think that's a true mark that the technologies have come of age and that they are preferred, and as you can see here, by an order of magnitude over investment in renewable energy, in nuclear power. Next slide, please. And how does that translate? So investment is one thing, but then that leads to changes in installed capacity. And on the left-hand side, again, looking at it at the global level, you can see how the installation of renewables, solar and wind, has far outpaced that of nuclear power. And the two different colors in nuclear power, the purple line above the top, which you can see is 392, is the total installed capacity. And then the one slightly lower is excluding those reactors that are in long-term shutdown. So those that are effectively in operation is the 362. So it's sort of half, I don't know, about 40, 50% of the installed capacity of solar and wind is represented by nuclear power. On the figure on the right-hand side shows you what this means in terms of production. Now you get more electricity per unit of installed capacity from nuclear than you do from solar and wind, which is reflected here. So overall, nuclear is providing more power from individually from wind and solar, but obviously in combination, it won't be, well, we'll see when the figures come out for 2020, it's going to be much, much closer. And I suspect within a couple of years, the overall output from solar and wind will exceed that of nuclear power, which is remarkable. Over a couple of decades, you've gone from providing a very small amount of electricity to one that is becoming the major source, or a major source of power. And that is what needs to continue, and that is what is likely to continue. And if you can show me the next slide, please. Because the costs of the technologies are falling. And this is what becomes a virtuous circle. As it becomes cheaper, then more people invest, and then that leads to lower costs because the production costs become cheaper, the installation costs become cheaper, they're operating more efficiently because people know how to work them better. All of these mean that in this case, the levelized cost of electricity is and this is in the United States, that over this period, so over a decade period, the costs of nuclear have gone up because there's been very little innovation, there's very, very little new learning, means that the overall cost is increasing, in this case by a third, compared to a fall of 90% from solar. So these trends are set to continue, and therefore we will see the domination of renewables within the low carbon power debate. Next slide, please. And yeah, this just shows as I mentioned, the combination of solar and wind, and here also just including other non-hydro renewables here, biomass, etc., that have overtaken the production from nuclear. But as I said before, nuclear and wind in themselves, wind and solar in themselves, I imagine within the next couple of years will exceed the production from nuclear power. Next slide, please. And just want to spend a few more minutes just talking about some of the key regions in the world, comparing nuclear and renewables. And again, on the left-hand side, we have capacity, and on the right-hand side, we have production. And here is the United States over the last effectively 2 decades. And we can see a really rapid deployment of wind. It's a bit stop-start. You can see around must be about 2013, a slowing down of the growth rate. This is because the policies deployed in the United States tend to be boom and bust. They tend to be saying the incentives to build will stop at a certain date 2 years from now. So everyone rushes to deploy, then it slows down, and then they put in place a new system and it picks up again. But overall, you can see that in installed capacity terms, wind has overtaken nuclear power, and in solar it's catching up very fast. Nuclear is still a dominant force in terms of production in the United States, but over the last 2 decades, very slightly increased, which is because they've increased the output from the existing power plants. But this trend is going to reverse as more reactors are closed because of they're not building more, so the average age is increasing, and they're finding it more and more expensive to operate. And we will see nuclear power being outcompeted, even just in terms of its operating costs, from wind and solar. Next slide, please. And here we have a similar couple of graphics for the EU, EU 28. And key here is the rather rapid slowing down of, or the reduction in overall generating capacity, installed capacity for nuclear power. So the turn of the century, 137 gigawatts of installed capacity down to 116. This is for a combination of coming to the end of their operating lives, like in the UK with all of the Magnoxes, or decisions to close reactors, for example, in Germany over the last couple of years, and some closed in the enlargement of the European Union. So yeah, a very clear trend, and likewise on the right-hand side with the annual production, the increase in renewables. What isn't shown on this graphic, but is notable for 2020, is that solar and wind and non-hydro renewables will be producing or produced more power than fossil fuels in the EU in 2020 for the first time. So not only is renewables dominating and overtaking nuclear power, but it's now dominating and overtaking fossil fuels. And this really is a turning point for the industry as a whole. And then the final couple of slides, please, next one, is China. As Mycle expressed, the importance of China within the global nuclear industry really is the source of new construction. But yet, as we see many things in China, China has very large growth, not only in nuclear, but in renewables. And it really is remarkable the extent to which you've seen solar and wind being deployed in China. We've seen that slow down slightly in the last couple of years, but has really picked up in 2020. So we'll expect to see very large production costs or increases in production costs from renewables in 2020. But here, wind is not only significantly larger in terms of installed capacity, it's 5 times larger than nuclear power. It is producing more power by about 20-30%. And so that trend will continue because of the falling costs of renewables. Even in China, nuclear is being outcompeted by renewable power. And I think that's the final slide. Yeah, I think that just repeats what we've talked about, the dominance of renewables compared to nuclear power. Thank you. Over back to you, Mycle, for the final conclusion.
Thank you very much, Antony. And I'm not going to read the entire slide here, but let me make a couple of points. The first one is really important to me. I don't think that we understand the real impact the global pandemic has had on the nuclear industry. And I think it's potentially a serious issue, a very serious issue, and there should be better understanding internationally what happened and what still is ongoing as consequence from that. When it comes to trends, nuclear power trends, you know, I think it's important to understand that people seem to make that difference between active phase-out policies, which means, you know, there's either very clear dates, like in Belgium or Germany, or in Taiwan or in Switzerland, where there is a prohibition by law to build new nuclear power plants, But this is actually only accelerating a trend that you can call an organic global nuclear phase out that is ongoing, because the turnover, the new build is too low to actually come up for closures in the future. So it is sort of a species that will organically die out. And when you look at the nuclear power versus renewables in 2020, we had seen something like, the final figures are not out, but something like 240 gigawatts added in non-hydro renewables versus 0.4 gigawatts net added for nuclear. I mean, that speaks for itself, and this is so important to realize how you judge this. I mean, you might find this a positive trend or a negative trend, but this is fact. And it shows that in the international electricity generating capacity market, nuclear power has become irrelevant. And finally, in terms of outlook, when you see this kind of exceptional role that China plays on the nuclear expansion, it's a real question. Is that possible over the longer term to sustain a full-scale nuclear power industry if all of the other countries are either cutting down or phasing out altogether? That's an industrial question one can discuss. And with this, I want to close this and thank you very much for your attention. Let me also say that we will share happily with participants the entire set of the slides, which we will make available to the organizers. So thanks again for having us, and I pass it back over to the GCAA.
好，我们谢谢四位国际讲者来带给我们这份这么详尽的一份报告。那我们刚刚可以听到这份报告里面分成几个部分啊，包含我们在看全球核能产业目前的现况，是由数据来跟大家提供哦。其实不管各位在我们现在立场，不管是支持核能或者反对核能，我觉得都要从数据来说话。那这份全球核能产业报告是的确提出了这样的一些数据。那这份数据呢，其实不是只有在今年而已哦。那这份数据是从1992年起，每年针对世界各国的核电厂运转状况跟全球核能产业趋势进行分析，以完整、客观而且有公信力的资料来做这一份报告。所以大家可以看到，就是刚刚从我们开始讲，就是说目前全球核能目前反映的一个现况，包含大部分的核电目前面临除役的一个状况，还有新建延宕的一个状况，那还有数量逐渐下降的一个这样的状况。那当然，因为在台湾，我们通常比较关心亚洲的情况，就是不管是日本或是韩国。但是在这份全球产业报告里面呢，讲者们可以跟我们介绍，不管就是从全球的视野来看，包含欧美，包含中东，然后从这样的数据来看看，到底世界核电产业目前的现况是如何的。那在这里面还有一个很重要的部分，就是刚刚也有提到，就是在从去年开始的这个 COVID-19 的一个疫情，到底对于核电厂的影响是如何？在这里面有一个专章是专门在介绍这个部分的。那刚刚讲者也做了一些介绍。那再来就是在刚刚最后一个部分，就是包含这个全球的再生能源跟核电做的一个对比。那这个对比从很多部分来谈，包含投资，包含装置容量，包含成本，到发电量。那得到的这样数据的结果是可以看到，目前再生能源持续有突变性的发展，而核电呢，不论在发电量、发电占比或发电成本上都不敌再生能源。那未来再生能源有可能也是能超过化石燃料，不只是超过核能而已。然后这是一个目前能源的一个现况。那我们感谢这位讲者带来的这些问题，我们要再次提醒大家，各位可以在这个您所拿到的简介上面做线上的提问，有一个 Schneider 的那个 QR code， 那大家可以扫描，然后直接做线上的提问。那我们等一下会开始我们的 Q&A， 但是我们现在会有10分钟的时间，先让我们台湾的讲者来讲一下台湾核电的现况，来为这份报告做一些连结。好，那大概为长就是10分钟。那在这其中呢，大家可以不但听这个台湾的回应，也可以开始做您的线上提问。 那等一下我们会开始 Q&A。那我们现在就请我们台湾这部分的讲者，是由绿盟的研究员陈诗婷来讲台湾的现况，谢谢。好，那非常感谢4位国际的讲者很精彩的报告。那我们在看这份世界核能产业报告的时候，其实觉得有非常多可以跟台湾做一些参照、一些对照的地方。那我这边就针对台湾的一些状况做一些回应跟分享。好，首先是全球的这个反应炉的年龄攀升的状况。那根据2020的世界核能产业现况报告，全球运作中的这个反应炉的平均年龄其实是持续增加的。那到2020年中期的时候，是平均是达到30.7年。那我们知道，在台湾的反应炉，我们这些既有的反应炉其实是运作更久的。那我们看到这个表格，其实我们的核一厂的2部机组其实是已经分别在2018年跟2019年的时候就已经达到40年的这个机龄，所以是已经正在处理当中。那我们的核二厂跟核3厂的各自的2部机组，其实都会在接下来的几年内就达到40年的要除役的这个年限。
这个放掉慢点。好，技术问题。
不好意思，请稍等一下，这个影像。OK， 那在反应炉的新建延宕的状况，那根据最新的这个世界核能产业现况报告呢，其实我们前面的图表就看到非常多新建延宕的状况，所以其实到2020年中为止，全球正在新建的这52座反应炉里面，其实有高达64% 的这个反应炉其实都是有计划，就是工程延宕的这个状况。那更是有其他，其实我们看到列入新建的状态已经超过10年的反应炉，其实也不止台湾其实在印度啊，在芬兰，那芬兰的话是在前2个月他们才终于完工了，但是在之前其实也是盖超过10年非常久的一个有号称那个芬兰核4的这个号称的这个反应炉，还有像日本跟法国跟俄罗斯其实都有新建超过10年的这个反应炉。那我们台湾的状况也是有核4的这个状况，就是它盖得非常非常久，从1999年动工到2014年封存，其实工期是长达了这个15年的时间。好，所以核4的现况是什么呢？其实就是它并没有完工，它的1号机是测试未通过，那2号机是施工未完成的状况。那它的建厂执照其实也已经在这个1009年就已经失效了，依法是不能再继续新建。那再加上它原本的这个原厂专案团队其实已经解散了，跟当初的一些它的零件是已经停产的状况，所以其实官方的评估就是说，如果要再继续去盖这样子的一个反应的这个核电厂，其实是需要至少7年的时间，7年以上可能也不一定盖好这样子。那在它的这个建厂经费呢，从最开始90年代它核定是1697亿，中间经过了4度的追加，是后来它的预算是增加到了2838亿。那官方一样是评估说，如果要再继续去盖的话，是需要至少投入788亿的这个经费。那其实在这个报告里面，其实也有一个章节是在讲那个除役嘛，除役的专章，它里面也一直提到这个除役的成本一直飞涨这件事情。那在台湾也是一样，这个是全世界也是台湾的状况，就是除役的经费、核废处置的经费是比原先预估的都一直在增加的。我们来看一下台湾的状况，其实当初台电在估的时候，估我们这个要做除役的这个经费，那除役是包括核废的这个处置。这所有的经费，它原本是估是3353亿，但是最新版的这个总费用就增加到了6200亿。可是呢， 我们这个核后端的这个营运的这个费用，它只有准备了4729亿，所以还短少了将近是1500亿的这个费用，是不足以来支付我们要做这个除役跟核废处置的这个经费。那其实，在福岛核灾后，其实台湾的这个能源转型，我们无论是有这个减碳、减空污的需求，还有我们这个非核的趋势，就是可以看到，其实我们有一个这样子能源转型的路径哦。那的确，在过去的时间，其实台湾的能源很多是主要是依赖燃煤跟燃气，还是依赖燃煤跟燃气。但是我们在这个能源转型的路径上，我们可以稍微大家看一下，我们占最主要的这个发电的这个来源是在2016年的时候是高达45%左右。那我们是政府提出来的这个能源转型的目标，是要在2025年的时候降到剩下27%。那燃气呢是作为这个次要的发电的来源，是要在从32% 增加到50%。那再生能源的部分，这个是我们希望去推动的一个发电的来源，其实在2016年的时候只有4.8%，那是有一个还蛮有野心的目标，是增加了这个5倍，是要在2025年的时候增加，是变成到这个20%。那核电的部分呢，在2016年12%，那到2025年就会是最后一座机组除役的那一年，所以那一年就会只有剩下1%。那一年之后就是不会再继续有核电的这个发电。所以这是在福岛核灾后，其实我们台湾提出的一个这样子能源转型的路径。好，那这个给大家看一下这个过去的趋势，各个发电量的这个成长的趋势，大家可以看到这个成长最陡的最上面的这一条线是燃煤发电，所以燃煤的确是过去很主要的一个能源，然后它成长的这个速度也很快。那另外一个一样是成长这个线很陡的，这个是燃气。那这边这个黄色的是核电，那核电在过去其实占比也曾经是很高过，那这几年才越来越重要性越来越低。那这个图有一个关键的地方，就是大家看到这个，是应该这边不好意思，就是这个在2017年的时候，大家可以看到这边是核电降到其实是大概是35年来新低的一个位置。核电是占最低的，可是在这个地方发生一件其实也值得注意的事情，就是这个地方其实是首次我们的空污计是这个燃气的发电超过燃煤。意思是什么？意思是我们在核电这么低的时候，我们并不需要大量的增加燃煤来去替代掉核电的这个发电，所以燃气终于增加比燃煤多了，燃煤终于降低了，但是这个时候其实也不需要依赖核电，所以这是一个打破了过去的迷思，觉得说，是不是我们非核、我们减核，我们就是要增加燃煤？其实我们在过去的这个发电情形上是看到的是不一样的事情。那再给大家看一下是前2年的这个台湾的再生能源的发展的情况，我们看一下这左边是发电量的部分，发电量部分我们看到是整个的2019年相较2018年的成长是成长，在这个上半年的这个期间是成长的是9.73%，那装置容量的部分是成长了23.14%。那在这个图表大家就可以看到，其实这个主要的成长很多主要的贡献是来自太阳光电。那最新在2020年的统计，我们看到的是说，整体台湾的再生能源的增加量是1.68 吉瓦的装置容量，那年成长率其实是高于全球的平均的，是达到21%的这个成长的这个成长率。好，那到所以2020年底为止，我们整个再生能源的占比是达到5.8%，其中风力跟光也是我们其实是希望是主要去推动的这个再生能源的，它就是占了绝大多数是已经占了，其中是3%。那这张图呢，大家可以看到的是过去10年的再生能源的成长的趋势。那绿色的部分就是整个再生能源的成长的趋势。这个橘黄色的部分就是它去标出来是太阳光电的部分。 所以大家可以看到，太阳光电占整个再生能源的发展的占比是越来越重要。那在过去这几年，也可以看到它的这个成长的趋势也的确是越来越快的。所以一直到2020年底，我们的整个再生能源的累积装设量是达到9119 megawatt。OK， 那这边有一个特别的，觉得蛮重要的资讯要跟大家分享，就是说，其实我们的再生能源在尖峰的时候，尖峰的时候可能就是我们的再生能源可能是中午的时候，风跟光加起来会特别的多。这个时间，这个尖峰的这段时间，它的发电占比其实已经占了总系统其实是19.1%，就是在这个尖峰的时间，那这个其实是已经超过核电的发电量。那为什么这个很重要？其实我们可以知道说，我们的太阳光电在出力最多，它发挥最多潜力的时候，其实也就是我们全台湾用电用最多的时候。所以它在这个时候，它占了非常多的这个发电的占比，它也就是说它可以为我们的这个用电的尖峰带来更多的贡献，可以舒缓我们这个用电尖峰的这个压力。所以这个意义上面，其实是可以看到这个再生能源它的重要性。那最后有一点点小小的结论，就是说，其实不管是在国际或是台湾，其实核电都并不是主要的发电来源。就是核电在全球来说，之前在高峰的时候，我记得它应该是占的是17%左右。那到现在其实就是在10左右的这个全球的占比。那台湾也是，过去台湾曾经是核电是占了50%这样的高占比，一直到近年呢，其实大概就是10到12左右这样的占比，它其实并越来越不重要这样子。那刚才前面也提到，就是说，其实全球的运作中的这些反应炉，其实有2/3以上的机龄都已经超过31年了。那台湾的核电厂也是在其列。那我们接下来势必就是要去面对我们核电厂除役的，要至少25年的这样子的一个除役的问题。那也必须要去面对到我刚才讲的，它的这个除役的成本是会不断的增加。那随着这个核废的问题也一直延后的，它的时程不断的延长，这个除役的成本也就会跟着不断的延长。所以使用核电也就会是成本越来越高的一件事情。好，那刚才也讲，就是其实全球有这个正在兴建中的这些反应炉，它的发生工期延宕的状况其实真的是不低的，它的这个延宕的比例是超过60%。那核四其实也在这个其中的工期延宕之列。那刚才国际讲者的简报里面也有提到，就是也有一些案例是它盖了一段时间，然后它延宕了，但最后它就是终止的这个暂停或是终止这个它的新建计划。其实那我们看到台湾的核四就是这样的情形。那最后一点我觉得很重要，就是其实特别是在台湾，我们讨论能源议题的时候，会有非常多的说法，就是去落入一个就是减煤跟减核没有办法同时并进的一个这样的迷思。但是我们其实看到不管在国际，不管在台湾，其实这个实际的发展趋势并不是如此。所以同时可以去减煤，然后减核跟增加绿电，这个其实是不管在国际或是在台湾，这个都是在福岛核灾后越来越明确的一个能源转型的趋势。那以上这一点，其实就是希望提供是我们从台湾的角度在检视这个国际的核电跟再生能源的发展趋势的时候，我们可以去看的几个重点的方向。那以上提供大家做一些参考，谢谢。好，我们谢谢陈世平研究员。好，那现在就接下来开始进行我们的 Q&A 时间。那请把我们的荧幕换为4位的讲者，那就由我来念出这个题目，然后再请我们的4位讲者来自主决定如何回答啊，是哪一位回答？好，那因为各位的题目有点多所以为了节省时间，我有些题目可能会采取合并好，那我们就开始。好，那感谢各位观众的提问那这些上面有一些不同部分的提问，我会把一些相关的题目放在一起。那首先是来问这个问题是国际核电趋势的一个问题就是国际上就是反应炉就是逐渐不运转停止新建的理由是什么？ 是因为安全成本的高昂选择停机呢，还是因为运转执照到期或有其他的考量因素？那再包含就是刚刚在提到的趋势里面，中国是近期比较活跃新建核电厂的国家，但也显示中国也盖了许多这个再生能源。请问对于中国而言，他们必须配合快速成长的经济使用大量能源，所以他们投入核能现象是不是无法避免？那学者各位对于中国的能源政策的评价是如何？那还有中国的核能发展趋势跟国际间的确有显著的差异。如果中国维持其核能产业，他们是会有可能有能力输出核能产业的吗？那这是第一个有关国际核电趋势的问题。好，那我再多增加一些就是有关厨艺的问题哦，我再多讲一些让我们四位讲者一起回答。还是四位讲者觉得可以先谈国际核电趋势的问题？想请问一下，先回答还是我们再多念几个问题？想请问一下。
Well, the first question was on why constructions would stop and why operation would stop. Those are actually two aspects, right? On the construction stops, why countries have given up building nuclear reactors? There is not one case. It really depends. And also the stages in which the projects were given up vary widely, from a few percent construction to 100%. In several cases, reactors were completed entirely, operational basically, and have not been put into operation. For example, in Austria or in Germany, reactors were entirely completed. But for example, in Austria, it was a decision which was political because there was a referendum, a national referendum, and the population basically decided that they didn't want to ever start that reactor that they had built. In the case of Germany, the reactor did not start up in a mixture of a safety analysis and the decision that was made by politicians to say, well, they scrapped the project because they didn't trust the safety of the case. In other areas, for example, most of the construction sites were abandoned in the United States, and most of these were abandoned for economic reasons, because in the 1970s, a key development was the change of legislation. And in many states, it was not legal anymore to pass on to the electricity consumer the increasing construction costs prior to startup of the reactors. And that effectively bankrupted a number of utilities that were building reactors. They just basically ran out of money. So there's many different possibilities why construction projects were stopped. When it comes to early closures, the main driver is economics. It is now very clear that in most of the markets in the world, the operational costs, only O&M, only operation and maintenance, becomes significantly more expensive than even start investing and starting up, for example, solar and wind. Not to talk about energy efficiency programs, which are many times more. They actually have negative costs, and they're available in the very short term. But if you have a situation where let's look at the record numbers currently. It's in Saudi Arabia that holds the current world lowest photovoltaic price. It's now 1 cent per kilowatt hour, or $10 per megawatt hour. Now, if you look at operational costs, even countries like the US claim they are now standing at let's say, around $30 per megawatt hour. So triple of the cost that we have as a record. And it's not exceptional anymore. I mean, the second lowest price is in Portugal, with just over 10 cents. $10 per megawatt hour, and in Spain it's around 15. So it's in many cases it's far below the pure operational costs, and that means even in terms of climate change decisions, that's a driver to choose rather invest the money rather in other options than continuing to operate nuclear reactors. If my colleagues want to add something.
Can I just say something on China, if that's okay? Just, Mike, do you want to did you have other points on that, or is it all right to go on to China? Yeah, just on China, it's a really important point. I mean, China, people look to China for lots of different trends, and as has been shown, it is, and as I covered, it is deploying around 40% of the world's reactors under construction are in China, but also it is a major powerhouse of deployment of renewables. And importantly, it's not only a deployer of renewables, it is a major constructor of renewables. So much of the solar panels, the top 10 solar panels are made in top 10 firms making solar panels are located in China, and in wind increasingly also. But what we're seeing in China is, and we have seen over the last, I guess, year, is a shift on climate change in China. So President Xi in the UN General Assembly in September proposed a carbon neutrality target for China for 2060. And within the 14th five-year plan, we're seeing a proposal to peak the use of coal. So there are shifts underway in China to decarbonize. And clearly, globally, we need that. China is the world's largest emitter. But the path that it takes is also crucial. And I think the more it goes down the path of renewables, which then has much larger benefits globally, because of, as I mentioned, in terms of as you have more production, then the production costs tend to go down and it becomes a virtuous circle. And that was really shown by China in the last 5 years as being such a large deployer and manufacturer of renewables has lowered the price. So yes, I suspect that we will continue to see nuclear having targets within the 14th five-year plan, but they will be relatively small compared to that of renewables. And I think that trend is likely to continue as China decarbonizes and reduces its reliance on coal.
好，还有其他讲者要回答的吗？好，那如果没有，我们进行下一个部分的问题。好，那我们再下一部分问题是跟核电除役有关。那有观众问到，有关核电除役的成本如此高昂的原因，是否可以再说明清楚一点？这样子不断的追加预算，为什么会继续追加？有没有案例是因为成本高昂的缘故导致无法除役呢？那也想请问，除役跟整个核电厂的技术、经济沟通的投入的成本到底是有多少？它的差异是什么？那再来关于除役技术的问题，就是核电除役的技术很专业，也需要很多资源投入。会建议台湾也是要效仿国际，来委托这些除役的专业公司来执行吗？核电的除役呢，对核能体系而言算是新兴产业，还是表示说这是一个核能是一个夕阳的产业？那这部分是有关核电除役的废弃物的问题，也就是核废料的问题。就是我们看到报告中完整除役的核电厂非常少，主要停留在准备期的原因是什么？另外想要知道完成除役后的高阶核废料是如何处理的，我们能如何参考国际的经验？谢谢。
Okay, well, I will start with the first on decommissioning costs. There's a lot of uncertainty about decommissioning costs. especially as I mentioned, because decommissioning 1 gigawatt reactor and what we call a standard reactor with 1 gigawatt of capacity and 40 years of operation has not yet been done. So there's a lot of unknowns concerning decommissioning costs. In Germany, in most cases, we had an increase in decommissioning costs, in the US also. You mentioned that there's a risk that it's never going to be completed. There's a risk here if the company doesn't have set aside the money for decommissioning. A case, for instance, is Germany, where we had the former East German reactors where money was never set aside. So now the decommissioning is done by the state. And maybe this is also increasing in the future as utilities, as we see, have a nuclear trend in the industry that it's going down. So this, of course, we have emerging renewables. This puts a lot of strain on the utilities, and there's, of course, a big concern that the monies are not going to be used, or are not available for decommissioning. This also depends on the funding system at place. From point of view of experience and US, I will combine those questions. Comparing decommissioning across different countries is very, very hard. If you look at Germany, we have there's more strict regulation here. For instance, all the waste has to be put into a geological facility, low and intermediate, but also high level waste. The reactor vessel has to be cut underwater. This is the hot zone that we mentioned. So it's very technologically demanding. And for some reactors, especially the tools have to be specifically designed and built for different reactors. So it's technologically very demanding. And it's, of course, an emerging sector. Especially if you look at the hot zone, the involved companies in this process are Westinghouse, it's Framatome, so the classical reactor vendors. They, of course, have a specific knowledge about the technologies that have been built, and those are also the companies that are deconstructing the vessel or the internal. So here's a huge sector evolving for conventional reactor vendors. And the US concerning, for instance, the US is different. The US is very fast. The US has not that strict policy concerning disposal. We had cases in the US where the vessel was taken out as a whole from the reactor. There was waste put into the vessel. It was used as a cast, so to speak, and it was buried as it is in some waste management facilities. So it's very, very different from other countries. Also in the US, concerning high-level waste, this has not been solved in any place in the world. So the case in the US is you have in some cases a greenfield where the reactor has been decommissioned, the buildings have been dismantled and are gone, but you still have an installation on place with the spent fuel, with the high-level radioactive waste. Here the spent fuel is stored on site in independent storage fuel installations. And some parts of the decommissioning is also high-level waste, is mostly the internals of the vessel. They are also stored in this facility. So high-level waste is a big issue. It's especially the coordination between decommissioning and waste management is very critical. And high-level waste has not been solved, as you all know, worldwide. And this is also affecting, of course, decommissioning. So I hope I didn't forget anything. Yeah, thank you for the question.
好的，那谢谢。那因为台湾就是核电正在迈向处理，所以我们也对这样的问题特别关心。那非常感谢您的解说。那我们接下来再问我们下面的一个问题。那下面一个问题是关于核电与气候变迁的一个关系。那在近期，我们可以看到欧盟的联合研究中心专家小组认定核能符合绿能投资的标准。想请问长子们对于这个消息的看法？那有许多的国家，包含像印度或是波兰等，似乎在持续使用核电来达到气候变迁、净零碳排的目标。那您如何看待这样的趋势？这是一个理想的方案吗？那我们最近看到比尔盖茨公开表示要阻止气候灾难，第4代的核电是解方之一。那也请问我们长子的看法。 那世界各国、全球目前在谈这个气候变迁跟净零碳排的时候，是否在趋势上有增加核电的这样的一个趋势？好，谢谢关于这个问题。
I can perhaps provide an answer first.
Sure.
I think it's an important point to examine the intersection or the interaction between nuclear energy and climate change. I mean, Mycle has done a great job in terms of dissecting the economic factor, which is really doesn't point to any promising contribution to nuclear, because if we are serious about climate change, economics has to be there. Otherwise, we will actually be circling ourselves and going for suboptimal solutions economically is not a good way if we're serious about climate change. But let me talk about other aspects that also require some attention. Again, if we're serious about climate change, we have to go for solutions that are deployable at any scale, in any region, because beside climate change, let's not forget that we still have large parts of the population, global population, that still has accessibility problem. We have large parts of Africa that are still without electricity. So we need not only to tackle climate change, but also we need to ramp up sustainable energy solutions in areas that are very challenging from a security perspective, from safety perspective. So is nuclear energy this global answer, a globally deployed technology that can go and be deployed under different circumstances? The answer, I believe, or we believe as a team N, is no. Another aspect is the speed of deployment. The construction time, and in the report we focus a lot about the analytics and the number, but let's not forget that there is also a leading time that goes before the construction time, and if you add these two numbers together, you can easily go into 15 years between planning and construction. Again, if we're serious about climate change, we need solutions that can be deployed on a much quicker pace. We need solutions that the decision-making in these solutions is decentralized, so they can be made very quickly without going into a lot of bureaucratic and governmental issues. I'm sure Mycle, perhaps, or other colleagues have other things to add, but I'm over from my side.
Well, I can say a few words. I mean, I think in the question was mentioned that a certain number of countries, whether it's Poland or others, actually have nuclear power integrated into their climate change strategy, and that's true. The problem is that this is on paper, and if you look at the example of Poland, I mean, Poland has had a nuclear power program and plans and ideas and fantasies since the 1970s. Poland had actually 2 nuclear reactors under construction. I think they started building in 1984, if my memory is correct, around the middle of the 1980s, just before Chernobyl happened. And they pulled the plug. It's one of those examples. They pulled the plug on these reactors finally in 1990. And if you look at, actually, I have traveled to Poland. This was my last trip before the lockdown in France. It was in early March 2020. And we have translated a big chunk of the status report into Polish, and we have discussed with many people. And in fact, you realize that there is very little basics for actually implementing what they put down on paper. And the key ingredient for something to happen is a financing package. And there is no financing package. And the reason is very simple. There is no buyer's market for nuclear power in the world. If you want to sell a nuclear power plant today, you have to bring the money. And so that leaves a very small number of actually proposing countries that think that they do this. They bring the money because they have other reasons, geopolitical, or they want to establish a long-lasting connection with the country. There are lock-in effects with this kind of deal. But we're talking, as Ali said, we're talking 15 years at the low end for a country that has no infrastructure. And at the same time, the other options are available. And that actually turns the effect of low carbon upside down. Because if I don't invest today in an economically effective and climate effective, by that I mean per dollar or euro invested, I can buy significant reduction. So let's say in the Polish case, reduction of emissions from coal-fired power plants, but I need them fast. So it's the combination of investment and time. And if the nuclear part of these strategies only kick in 15 years at the best, the investment into nuclear power actually helps destroying the climate, because the money is not used for other climate effective options that we have available today. And I think the examples we do have on the ground, and Finland is really a good example. They started building in 2005. They made that option. They said, we have nuclear power in our climate plan. Starting 2009, that was when they thought they have nuclear power available as low carbon option. And now we are 2021, and still they have to buy other power, or they have to import power, because the nuclear industry has not delivered. So that's another part of the equation, is the reliability of actually being able to implement what I put down on paper in a policy strategy.
Thank you for the responses, but you also mentioned about the time issue. We have another question here. We have seen that in this report, there's one chapter. It's talking about small experimental reactor. And after it's been mentioned in this chapter, maybe people may think this is a new experimental type of generation 4 type of reactor. Would that be the future development that can work with the climate change? Can you talk about this? Elaborate on this thing. Generation 4 small reactor linking to climate change.
Ali, you want to have a go on that?
Sure. Yes, I think different developers, nuclear developers in the world, are now using this pretext of small modular reactors as the next step for them. And if you ask me, my personal view on this is that this is like providing a solution to no problem, essentially, because a lot of the problems that large reactors have transfer to small reactors. For example, and I speak from my experience with the Middle East, part of the problem with nuclear reactor deployment is public acceptance and public approval. And public approval will not shift if this is a small reactor or a large reactor, because for the public, a nuclear reactor is a nuclear reactor, and the dangerous and harmful material and radiation present in both systems. Now, the rationale from the industry is that these new reactors can be deployed in new markets. So they come up as a supply solution. But again, if you look at the problem, or if you look at the other side of the equation, what is the demand? Where is the demand? So far, we have not seen any realistic demand for these reactors, except in the countries where these companies are operating. And all these demand is somehow artificial, in the sense is that this is governmental programs to assist these companies to develop their nuclear technologies. So far, we haven't seen any real demand from new countries that are asking to purchase these reactors. The third component, which is very important, going back to the economics, large reactors are large for a reason, and this reason is called economies of scale, which is, you could lower your costs by building more, so the cost per energy unit will be lower. However, this process is reversed when you go in the opposite direction. So when you go from large to small, the cost per kilowatt hour will be much, much higher. So therefore, although the cost of these reactors, the absolute cost is lower, however, their cost per unit energy or their cost per kilowatt hour is substantially higher than the cost of electricity. And therefore, we are not only providing a solution that has the same problems as the large reactors, but we are also providing it with double, if not triple, the cost.
Yeah, I might just to add, as there is the economics, there's also the time factor. And, when we're talking about SMRs, there is no Western country at this point that has authorized a design, even a design. Actually, the only country that has a general design authorization for one model is in the United States. And they are projecting to start up a prototype by the end of the 1920s. So if we get a prototype of one model that it has a general design certification, which is not yet a construction license or something. If we're talking a prototype by 2030, that would mean that you could build these things in series, maybe 2040. And we're back to square one. This is much too late for what we're talking about. We're talking about an emergency. And I always wonder, why are we even looking for that if we have other options that are actually available right now? And for costs that are proven commercial, that you don't need any prototype solar panels anymore. I mean, that's over, right? So it's highly commercial, it's mature, it's all there.
好的，谢谢两位讲者的回答。那我们接下来的问题是跟核电与再生能源的比较有关了。还是如刚刚所说的，就是到底核能跟再生能源的差异为何？就是在欧盟之前的研究中心里面认定核能符合绿能的投资标准，那其实会让大家会想了解这个到底为什么会符合？那它的这个对比起来到底是如何对比的？那尤其是在这个再生能源目前还有一些其他的问题了。那我们这边是有提出，就是再生能源在应对这个气候变迁的极端气候是否会受到影响，或是否会造成再生能源的供电的不稳定。那再来就是再生能源其实它还有一些会碰到有一些环境的问题，或是选址的问题。那尤其像台湾这样土地狭小的一个国家，环境成本是必须要付出的。想知道就是欧洲等国家在发展再生能源的过程是来如何面对这些环境争议。好，大概再生能源问题是这个，那不知道哪一位讲者可以回答。
Well, I have a go on that one then, and the others can add to it. I mean, first on the intermittency issue, you see there's you can basically say it's if you drop the terminology, the technical terminology issue, there is no such thing as a power source that generates without any interruption at any 24 hours a day, all year round. That doesn't exist. So we're talking about availability, reliability, flexibility. we're talking about issues that make it possible to supply energy services to people. And so how you can do that in the most intelligent way. And it's obvious that the sun doesn't shine during the night. But you see, what is very interesting is that the sun has been pretty reliable so far on coming up every day. That might not be forever like that, but it's pretty reliable. And it's interesting that if you look at the reliability of nuclear power plants, I have shown you the example of the French fleet. You realize that even in when there is an outage, we had a very long outage where they had the outage period was redefined. So the grid connection timing was redefined 40 times. You don't have to redefine when the sun goes up. You know that, right? So, and the most interesting thing I thought was within the last 15 hours, the operator changed the timing when it switches on 1,300 megawatts. That's not negligible. That's a very big source. And it had to change 5 times in 15 hours the timing when it would the source would be available. When we're talking predictability of solar and wind, I'll give you an order of magnitude. The precision of within an hour of the following day, and that's we're talking commercial. If I'm selling solar power or wind power for a specific hour the next day, the precision in forecasting of meteorological models in France is between 2 and 3% national. 2 to 3%. Can you believe that? Like today, we can very reliably predict how much power will be available nationally in France from solar and wind. We don't know with nuclear. There's a power plant, maybe it's there, maybe it's not there. And so this whole idea that we have about intermittency has to completely be changed and adapted to what we have when we are dealing with solar, wind, biomass, hydro, etc. The idea is to have a composition, like as the thinker Amory Lovins always says, think of it as an orchestra, and you have to fine tune the instruments so it becomes a mix of music that works. And with electricity, it's the same thing. You have a complementarity, which, by the way, seasonally is fantastic between solar and wind, because you have more wind in the winter and less solar in the winter. So there is already a certain complementarity. Then you can add biomass or hydro to fill up the holes. Then you can do demand response. So where you say, well, if every fridge in a household, every freezer is a storage of electricity, and that you can fine tune according to the needs of the service you want to get out, which means cooling or reheating or mobility or whatever it is. So we have to rethink these systems. And the idea of intermittency has dramatically changed with higher levels of renewables. Somebody else wants to add something to?
Maybe just quickly, if I may, also one important factor that would really make a difference is the improvement in storage technologies. And now we are not talking about science fiction or topics that are still in development. This is a reality, and storage, like renewables over the last few years, which have witnessed dramatic decline in cost, storage also the same. And it's just a matter of time until this intermittency question or issue, I think, would go away forever.
there's also one saying which I always think is interesting. If you think of it as a technological challenge, what is more complex? Is to store radioactive waste for 1 million years, or is it easier to think about options how to store electricity for 24 hours?
好的，那谢谢我们各位讲者的回答。因为时间的关系，我们也必须要结束了。那非常感谢，就是讲者花了这么多的时间来回答我们的提问。那很可惜，因为时间有限，我们不要回答到讨论。我们来再次谢谢各位讲者，谢谢。那最后，我们3位讲者有没有最后有
？Well, thank you very much for having us.
Final word.
谢谢你们为这个台湾的这个我们现场观众带来这么多分享的这些知识，宝贵的知识，谢谢你们。
Well, I think it was a great initiative. Thank you so much for setting this up. Thank you so much for having us. And I definitely hope that we can do that in a presential manner in the months or years to come. Thanks again.
Thank you very much.
好，那我们今天的这个论坛就到这边结束。那很抱歉没有办法有所有提问了，因为我们的国际连线时间是非常精确的。好，那我们刚刚才提的这些问题呢，相信都是大家非常关心的部分哦，就是关于核电与再生能源的比较，还有包含我们如何来面对气候变迁所谓的2050年进行碳排，我们能源政策该往哪个方向走。那今天这个论坛其实是特别在针对核能的部分，那我相信其他部分我们还会有陆续其他系列的一些讲座，好，或者是一些工作上的机会，也欢迎大家能参加。